So I'd like to start my talk with an illustrative story which I believe will help to set the context for the points that follow. So just imagine the following scenario. Imagine that you're walking down a street in some town or city. Ahead of you, you see a skinhead loitering suspiciously outside an office building. He isn't particularly large, but he has tattoos down both arms and a rough-looking face. He looks nervous and keeps glancing towards the door of the office building that he's standing outside of, as though he's waiting for someone to come out. A man in a smart suit walks out of the office building holding a suitcase. The skinhead looks intensely at him for a moment and then, having recognised him, launches himself at him, pushing him to the ground. The man in the suit manages to break his fall with his hands and immediately starts trying to break free of the skinhead, who is sitting on top of him, trying to pin his head to the pavement with one hand, whilst also trying to grab hold of the man's suitcase with the other hand, which has fallen to the pavement just beyond his reach. It occurs to you that you should probably call the police, but just as you take out your mobile to make a call, an unmarked police car pulls up and uniformed policemen rush out. When they reach the two men, the first policeman pulls out his handcuffs, but, to your surprise, handcuffs the man in the suit. The other policeman greets the skinhead, who you now realise was an undercover cop, in a friendly and familiar way to check that he's okay. A second marked police car pulls up, and two more policemen get out and take away the handcuffed suspect. The shaven-headed undercover cop gets into the unmarked police car with his two colleagues, and they drive away. So how is this story of relevance to this talk on recent events in Israel and Gaza? It's of relevance because it shows the fallibility of our assumptions. Most of us, no doubt, like to consider ourselves to be fair-minded people who reject and avoid blatant forms of prejudice, such as racism, sexism, and homophobia. But as commendable as that is, the truth is that all of us operate according to a set of assumptions about other people and the world that we live in that constitute the basic operating manual, so to speak, through which we navigate our way through life. And although these assumptions might work quite well in terms of allowing us to function on a day-to-day basis and perform specific tasks, the richness, variety and complexity of life inevitably means that they will be very wrong some of the time. And that doesn't need to be a problem if we are open-minded in our attitude towards information that allows us to know when our model of the world is incorrect and have the flexibility of mind to adjust our views and beliefs accordingly. But when everything that we hear or see on a particular topic appears to confirm what we think we already know, when our views on a particular topic are based upon our implicit trust in an authority that actually has an interest in us thinking about things in a particular way, or when we are so emotionally or socially invested in holding certain beliefs that we automatically turn away from any information that seems to contradict them, then there's a very real danger and possibility of us going through the whole of our life with views that are both incorrect and to all practical purposes unchallengeable. And so it is of the greatest importance that we learn to approach life with an attitude of mind that allows us to challenge our own assumptions and beliefs if we want to be genuinely open to learning and progress. This is particularly important, indeed essential, with respect to topics which the society we live in, and quite possibly the family environment we are brought up in, have taught us to make certain assumptions about. And this is very much the case with respect to anything to do with politics, where every single belief or idea, from taxation to water fluoridization, is a contested ground with real-world consequences, in which different parties vie for power and influence for the sake of the furtherance of their particular aims and objectives, and in which emotions can easily run high and completely inhibit clear and open-minded thinking. And being genuinely open-minded is a real challenge, because the natural human tendency is to just replace one assumption with another, which may rectify some of the mistakes of the previous assumption, but which is still a misrepresentation of what is really happening. And so, for example, returning to the story just given, it is quite likely that we will replace our initial assumption that the skinhead was trying to rob the man in the suit with a second assumption that the man in the suit was a dangerous criminal who had been justly apprehended by the police. But we don't know that. Perhaps it was a case of mistaken identity, and that by the time they reached the police station, the police had already realised that they had apprehended the wrong man. Or perhaps the man arrested was a local politician campaigning against police corruption, and the police have knowingly arrested him on spurious charges in order to get him out of the picture. You might think that an unlikely scenario. The police aren't always perfect, but they're not that bad, and wouldn't be involved in doing something like that. But suppose I were to tell you that the story just described took place in a South or Central American country in which police corruption was endemic and collusion between the police and the drug cartels was commonplace. You would then realise the important point that assumptions that we make about the world in which we live, which are at least reasonably accurate in one context, may be wildly inaccurate in another context. And so, if we want to have any hope at all of gaining an accurate understanding of the world that we inhabit, we need to support the processes that are able to support us in the task of separating the real from the unreal and illusory. And this applies to both internal cognitive processes, our own manner of thinking, as well as external organisations and the way in which they operate. The American novelist Mark Twain has been quoted as saying, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so." And we'd be well to bear this point in mind as we enter into the twilight zone of the mainstream media's coverage of Israel and Palestine, in which nothing is quite as it seems, and most of what we thought we knew for sure just ain't so. So let's start then with what many of us think we know for sure about recent events with respect to Israel and Gaza. They were triggered, as we know, by the Hamas kidnappings that took place on the 12th of June. In response to those kidnappings, the Israeli launched a major police operation to apprehend and arrest those responsible, and in protest at those arrests, Hamas started firing rockets into Israel. The Israelis responded to those rocket attacks by launching raids upon the rocket sites in Gaza, which unfortunately resulted in many civilian casualties due to Hamas's policy of deliberately locating their rocket launchers in civilian areas and their use of human shields. The Israelis later launched a ground invasion for the purpose of destroying terror tunnels, which had been constructed by Hamas for the purpose of launching attacks against people in Israel. Hamas eventually accepted a ceasefire agreement at the end of August, and things have been relatively calm since then. There has been quite a lot of concern about the scale of damage done to Gaza, and there is a certain amount of controversy and dispute between politicians and members of the public who believe that Israel's actions were disproportionate, quote unquote, and those who support Israel's right of self-defense. So this seems to me to pretty much summarise the public perception of recent events in Israel and Gaza and Palestine, which in any case was subsequently eclipsed by media coverage of the Scottish referendum and the actions of the Islamic State and the international American-led response to that. However, those of us following events in the region closely had a rather different perception of events, one which encapsulates a broader understanding of what is actually happening, which can be traced back a long way, but which, for the sake of selecting a necessary starting point, we can chart from the start of the so-called Kerry peace talks led by Senator John Kerry, which started on the 29th of July 2013. So let's take a look at a timeline of key events of what happened from then onwards. So, on 14th of November 2013, after 3.5 months of getting nowhere in terms of getting any meaningful commitment from the Israelis, the Palestinian team quit the negotiations, citing the fact that Israel was continuing settlement construction on land in the West Bank that was supposed to be designated for a Palestinian state. On 30th of December 2013, the chief Palestinian negotiator, Syed Erahat, said that Israel had shown through its actions that it wanted to destroy the possibility of a Palestinian state, and that the Palestinians would be seeking recognition through international bodies instead. This was on the basis of Palestine being upgraded to non-member observer status by the General Assembly a year previously, on 29th of November 2012. On 10th of January 2014, the Israeli government approved plans for building a further 1,400 homes for illegal settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories, providing further confirmation, if any was needed, that they had no interest whatsoever in permitting the creation of a Palestinian state. On 23rd of April 2014, Fatah and Hamas, the two Palestinian factions, Fatah who govern the so-called Palestinian Authority and Hamas who govern in Gaza, agreed to form a unity government and to hold fresh elections. It should be noted that the lack of communication and coordination between Fatah and Hamas was extremely detrimental to the Palestinians in many ways, including the coordination of health services for people in Gaza, and that a resumption of good relations between the two political parties was a necessary precondition for any form of functioning Palestinian democracy. The EU and the US said that they would only be willing to recognise and negotiate with a Palestinian unity government if Hamas agreed to accept the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas, president of the so-called Palestinian Authority, which would be more appropriately named the Palestinian Non-Authority, since they take most of their orders from Israel. However, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated ominously that Abbas would have to choose between peace with Hamas and peace with Israel. Abbas refused to be intimidated by what looked to the Palestinians like a thinly veiled threat of violence. And Netanyahu, who was furious about this, immediately withdrew Israel from the so-called peace negotiations. On 15th of May, during Nakba Day celebrations, the day on which the Palestinians commemorate their dispossession in 1948, in which 750,000, 750,000 of them, were forced into exile by force, Israeli soldiers opened fire on Palestinian youths in the West Bank city of Betunia, near the Offa prison, a prison for political prisoners in the West Bank. Some of the boys were throwing stones, but they were landing on the ground short of where the soldiers were. 2 boys, one 16 and one 17, were killed. Another was shot in the chest but survived, and 8 others were shot in the arms or legs. The incident was caught by security cameras by a Palestinian shop owner, put online and viewed by many Palestinians who were very angry and upset about it.